Hey there, it's Seb Frey here with another exciting episode of It's a Seb Show. And today I want to talk about the earnest money deposit. All right, so as everybody knows, or almost everybody knows, when you go to buy a house, after your offer is accepted, you have to make a deposit on the house, right? You have to give them some kind of money to show that you are an earnest, a serious buyer, right? That you're not just screwing around, right? You got to have some skin in the game, and that is called the earnest money deposit. So the earnest money deposit typically ranges anywhere from like $100 up to 3%. So it's very rarely $100, but I've seen $100 earnest money deposits before. But I would say that 1% as a minimum is more common, and up to 3% is also pretty common, especially for higher priced properties. So now, one question is what is the purpose of the earnest money deposit, right? So the purpose of the earnest money deposit really is just exactly that. It is to show the seller that the buyer is in fact an earnest buyer, right? He wants to have some skin in the game. And really, that is pretty much all that deposit is good for, because the earnest money deposit is fully refundable, right? Fully refundable deposit. Now you're saying, well, what's the point in even having a fully refundable deposit? And the answer is, well, it's because it's fully refundable up to a point, right? And what is that point? That point is when the buyer releases all of their contingencies for the purchase of the property. So when a buyer writes an offer on the property, there are typically contingencies, right? So the three big ones are an inspection contingency, right? The buyer is going to do their due diligence and make sure that the property is as advertised, or at least acceptable to the buyer, right? So the next contingency is the appraisal contingency. So with the appraisal contingencies, the buyer is saying, hey, it must appraise for at least purchase price, or I can cancel the contract. So not all offers obviously have appraisal contingencies. Cash offers frequently do not. Offers with a big, huge down payment frequently do not. But many offers do have an appraisal contingency. And the last contingency that a buyer has is usually a contingency for the buyer's loan. Now, again, if you're a cash buyer, then you're not going to have a loan contingency. But about 3/4 of all deals do involve some kind of financing. And so lots of buyers will have a loan contingency as well, right? So the contingency period, the total period, typically lasts about 3 weeks, right? And the typical escrow lasts about 90 days. So you're pretty far into the transaction before the buyer would need to release all of their contingencies. Now, once the buyer has released all of their contingencies, whatever those contingencies may be, the buyer's earnest money deposit at that point becomes non-refundable, or rather I should say theoretically non-refundable, or non-refundable per the contract. And why do I say that, right? The reason I say that is because let's just say that after the buyer releases their contingencies, for some reason the property doesn't close, right? So at that point, what happens to the earnest money deposit if we have a cancellation of the contract after the contingencies have all been released? Well, the thing is that for money to leave escrow, money does not leave escrow, and that is where your earnest money deposit lives. It lives in escrow. A neutral third party holds on to it. No money leaves escrow without a written instruction from both buyer and seller, right? So even though the deposit is theoretically or per contract forfeit at that point, the buyer has to sign another piece of paper handing that deposit over to the seller. So does that happen? Well, first of all, it's pretty rare for a contract to fall apart after the buyer has released all the contingencies. The buyer is not going to release all the contingencies and put that deposit at risk until they're pretty darn sure that they're going to close, right? So that's a number one thing to consider. So the number two thing to consider, like if the offer falls apart at that time, is the buyer going to hand that deposit over to the seller and just say, you know what? I don't need that $20,000 or $30,000. You can just keep it, right? Does the buyer do that? In my experience, the buyers do not often just right away sign a piece of paper and saying, here you go, seller, have 20, 30, 40, $50,000. I don't need that money. Usually a buyer is going to try to get their deposit back, right? Because they're not going to just sign a piece of paper, right? They're going to say, hey, well, like something happened, something came up, I wasn't able to perform, I want my deposit back anyway. So most of the time, I got to tell you, it's sad to say, but most of the time a seller is going to give that deposit back to the buyer. And here's the reason why: because an escrow company is not going to hold two deposits from two different buyers, right? So you would then have to go and open another escrow somewhere else, because your current escrow company is not going to have two deposits for the same property. It's not gonna They're not gonna do that, right? And the other reason why is because if it really comes down to it, what a buyer is going to do is they're going to say, you know what, I'm just going to take you to court. And they say that they'll hire a lawyer and file a lis pendens on the property, right? Which means like a pending lawsuit. It's a pending lawsuit on the property. No lender is actually going to loan on that property. So at the end of the day, most of the time, the buyer will get their deposit back, because ultimately it's just going to stop the seller from meeting the goal. It's going to slow the seller down and stop them from actually selling the property. Now, I've been selling real estate for darn near 18 years at this point, and I have seen a few deposits go to the seller when the property did not close. I've seen it 1.5 times. So one time seller kept a whole deposit, and one time seller kept 50% of the deposit. But in both of those cases, the buyer had already released all their contingencies, and even after releasing all their contingencies, had asked for several extensions on the close of escrow. And finally, when it was abundantly clear that the buyer would not perform, the seller said, you know what, I've given you tons of chances, I want your deposit. And in 1.5 cases, I saw the buyer give the deposit away. And one of those cases, I have to say, the agent did a spectacularly bad job representing his client, because they just gave up the deposit without even trying to negotiate at least a partial retention of the deposit. They just said, yeah, you know what, you can have it. It wasn't a large deposit. It was like $7,000 or $8,000, but still a fair chunk of change. So just know that right from the get-go, that the purpose of an earnest money deposit really is just to show that you have an earnest buyer, that he has some skin in the game, that he can't just walk away from the deal without saying nothing, right? Like the buyer just can't say, yeah, goodbye, I changed my mind. There's a little more to it than that. And that's the whole point of an earnest money deposit. Hey, listen, before I let you go, could you do me a huge favor? Would you give me a thumbs up? Would you give me a like? Would you give me a comment or a share? That would be totally awesome, and I would really, really appreciate it if you could help me sort of get the word out on social media about It's a Seb Show. All right, hey, thanks again so much for watching, and I will have another episode up again before too long.